Well, thank you everyone again for joining us today. We're Eco El Paso, and this is our 13th annual conference. This year we are virtual due to the pandemic. The title of the conference is Sustainability During a Pandemic. And today we have two more speakers that are going to be joining us today. Father Robert Mosher, Father Bob, as I call him, and Rabbi Ben Zeidman. And their topic today is going to be Judeo-Christian contributions to a sustainable lifestyle. So I wanted to just make that quick intro, and I'll let you guys take it over from here.
Thank you, Shelby. Before we start our PowerPoint presentation, I just want to say a few words by way of introduction. By sustainability, we're referring to a way of life that breaks with the consumer lifestyle that has damaged our natural home and contributes to climate change by polluting our water and land, exhausting our natural resources, and warming our atmosphere with greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide, methane, and other contaminants. The US Environmental Protection Agency describes sustainability as creating and maintaining the conditions under which humans and nature can exist in productive harmony to support present and future generations, end quote. It has been noted that sustainability proposes enormous shifts in thinking, and Rabbi Zeidman, with me tonight, and I believe that we can offer intellectual, ethical, and spiritual tools and concepts that can help us make that shift, essential to restoring that harmony. In our focus on what our two closely related faith traditions bring to the table of a sustainable lifestyle, we will identify some of the spiritual and ethical sources that have been handed on to the present generation of Jews and Christians, starting with our shared inspired texts and proceeding to the distinctive teachings and spiritual riches of each faith community over the centuries to the present time. It is at the same time a chance to show how the concept and practice of interfaith cooperation and dialogue in this area of sustainability provides vast resources for the task. In this way, we hope to provide an example of how the religious and spiritual traditions of our human family, all of them, are forces for peace among people and for harmony in repairing our broken relationship with the planet. My presentation tonight is not going to require as much work as Rabbi Zeidman's presentation, because I only have to cover about 2,000 years of Christian contributions, and he's got 4,000 years to catch us up on. So by participating together in this presentation tonight, we are also contributing to the ongoing healing of our own relationship of Jews and Christians. As we know, this relationship has been deeply split by the Holocaust, in which 6 million Jews, men, women, and children of all ages, were systematically murdered. This healing, sadly, is needed as much today as in the past, as anti-Semitism continues to manifest itself in destruction and death, even in our own country and even in our own times, with a truly shocking boldness. I'm Father Bob Mosher of the Roman Catholic tradition of the Christian faith, and I am delighted to have with me in this joint presentation Rabbi Ben Zeidman of the Reformed Jewish tradition. When the ecological movement began in the 1960s, commentators and scholars in both the Jewish and Christian spheres contested an initial finger pointing at our traditions as if it were a major cause of environmental destruction. In fact, however, we'll see here how the belief in a creator of all that exists actually carries with it a compelling sense of responsibility and care for the planet in our communities, and not absolute ownership. As the years passed, numerous movements of ecological justice and sustainable lifestyle drew their inspiration from spiritual and religious sources, from a wide variety of spiritual traditions, which we'll tell you about tonight. Traditions well beyond the Jewish and Christian faith communities, which is our focus. We're going to limit ourselves today to the two that we represent. But suffice it to say that when the spiritual dimension of existence is considered, All the major organizations and movements of a religious nature tend to oppose the short-sightedness of purely and exclusively technical and scientific theories of exploitation of natural resources and progress, and instead strongly encourage the inclusion of other perspectives, other sources of wisdom, other value systems and ethical visions in the establishment of policies and procedures for the management and systematic appropriation of the resources of our natural home. The very development of, in all cultures, of practices and belief systems of a spiritual nature indicate a deeply felt human need to restore, that is, to reconnect, as the word religion connotates etymologically, to a source of harmony and peace and freedom that is otherwise experienced as missing when the destructive effects of a consumer materialistic lifestyle began to become widespread. Rabbi Zeidman and I will be open to take questions and to engage in discussion at the end of our presentation. I'll hand it over now to you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Father Mosher. I'm gonna just pop open my, can you see my presentation here?
Yes.
Yes,
Okay.
sir.
So I wanted to get us started where it makes sense to begin, which might be in the beginning, and with a conversation with the text about stewardship, Genesis stewardship, and the Jewish biblical principles of sustainability. Now, I want to backtrack for a second and say that faith may or may not tell us how we got here. I leave that to you as individuals to decide for yourselves, but it regardless tells us what to do now that we are here, what we are supposed to do and how we are supposed to be. And I want to acknowledge much of this portion of my presentation, specifically the pieces on the book of Genesis, are informed by Dr. Jonathan K. Crane, who is a professor of bioethics and Jewish thought at Emory University. In Genesis 1, we read this text, which will hopefully be somewhat familiar to many, but perhaps not to all. Genesis 1's description of the creation of mankind goes like this. Beginning in verse 27, we read, "And God created the human," using that term because it's not necessarily clear quite yet what the specific gender is. The human in the divine image. In the image of God created the human. Male and female God created them. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fertile and increase, fill the earth and master," or subdue it, depending on how you translate the Hebrew. "And rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and all the living things that creep on the earth." God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant that is upon all the earth, and every tree that has seed-bearing fruit. They shall be yours for food. And to all the animals on the land, to all the birds of the sky, and to everything that creeps on the earth, in which there is breath of life, I give all the green plants for food. And it was so. So this presentation of creation, of man and woman, of people in the world, explains the origins of our power. That is to say, we are a reflection of God. We are the echo of the divine in the world. And as the divine rules the universe, so we are given responsibility and dominion over all that was created before us. The eternal question of any self-aware creature is, why am I here? What am I supposed to be doing with this life? In an ancient age, thousands of years ago, we are already told that we have responsibility for the planet. That like any other ruler, we might exploit and exhaust what is available to us, or we can seek to fulfill our responsibility to maintain the balance of the natural world and to do what we might need to do to ensure the sacred order of the world is maintained. In this sense, we can all see a rational conclusion to the very concept of our creation in Genesis 1, that sustainability and proper stewardship is not only going to wind up playing to our own self-interest in the long run, that we have a response, but that we also have a responsibility granted to us by the divine over the world that God created, a world which might be ours to manipulate to some degree, but one which is not ours to destroy, demolish, abuse, or ruin, because it is a sacred gift given to us as a sacred trust. And to temper Genesis 1 and the story of creation as told there, we read Genesis 2, where mankind is created in this way. In the second chapter of Genesis, the eternal God formed human from the dust of the earth. God blew into humans' nostrils the breath of life, and human became a living being. The eternal God planted a garden in Eden in the east and placed there the human whom God had formed. The eternal God took the human and placed it in the Garden of Eden to till it and to tend it. And in this version, or this story of creation, humanity is created from the dust of the earth. We are of the earth, and we are given the task of tilling and tending the earth. And this clearly shows our responsibility as stewards of the earth. It even talks about being careful about what we eat. When we do not listen, when we abuse our responsibility, when we eat of the wrong fruits, we are punished with removal from the Garden of Eden, from that perfect place which we were given in the first place. That is to say, we know what it is like to abuse the earth and are given a clear warning to never do that again. And aside from the religious implications and the implications of faith, ancient scripture already sets a standard for our responsibility, not only to ourselves, but also to the world. We're commanded to care for and to worry about the well-being of the natural world. That sense of commandedness implies a feeling of obligation, an obligation which, if broken, will have disastrous results for us. And we see those results around us all the time. And speaking of which, if we look at this terrible hurricane season, just by way of example, I'd like to point to a recent statement by the Union of Reformed Judaism, which represents the largest Jewish denomination in the country, who made a statement in 2017 about the impacts of climate change, in which they reflected words from Genesis, from another favorite part for many of us, and that is from the section of Genesis which discusses Noah. And they wrote that in Genesis 9, God promises not to destroy the earth by flood, stating, "I will remember my covenant between me and you and every living creature among all flesh, so that the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh." God does not, however, preclude the possibility that humanity, by our own short-sighted behaviors, may destroy the earth by flood or other means. So today, our careless disregard for the environmental impact of our actions has set us on a path that is damaging and could ultimately harm human health and desolate our planet. From the ethics outlined in the very early expressions of the ancient Hebrews' interpretation of our roles and responsibilities in the world, we are clearly called upon to take responsibility for how we make use of this world, which we have been given to care for and to look after. We are given the power to exploit and eventually destroy this gift, but we are warned that this power is meant to be used for good, to ensure the continuity of humanity, of all creatures in all the world, by continuing to remind us that we are caretakers, that we are set in place by God's kindness and given this world to tend it, to look after it, but never to fully own it for ourselves. We are inherently warned to be careful with it. We are but stewards, we are not creators. And that means that we must be careful not to destroy. And so I'll leave Genesis with so many more things that we could talk about and turn it over to you, Father Bob.
Thank you, Rabbi. I'm going to turn now to Jesus of Nazareth, his teaching and his example. When we look at the word sustainability, of course, this is a modern word that did not exist in its present sense in any language when the first Christian sacred writings appeared in Greek in the years after the earthly life of Jesus of Nazareth. So when I turn to consider the written testimony about the preaching and the modeled behavior that Jesus offers us in this field of sustainability, testimony which we Christians consider to be the inspired word of God, together with and equal in importance to the Hebrew scriptures, I will focus on themes that are related to our understanding of sustainability rather than an actual term that could be its equivalent. For instance, let me begin with one of the clearly relevant passages regarding the lifestyle that Jesus teaches his followers or disciples to adopt. As a teacher, often given the name Rabbi by his original followers, since all of them were Jewish, Jesus wanted to alert his listeners and observers about a new age and reality that was about to enter into history, a long-awaited reality called the Kingdom of Heaven in the Gospel of St. Matthew. Let's go down a little, yeah. And the next one, Rabbi, thank you. Much of the mission of Jesus was to clarify this concept, the kingdom of heaven, since expectations were diverse at that time and sometimes contradictory, either linked by a purely political expectation of freedom from Roman oppression on the one hand, or at the other extreme, completely otherworldly, preceded by apocalyptic destruction. Jesus sought to assure his listeners, as the gospel writers inform us, that the kingdom of heaven was about to enter history with Jesus himself was a reality that would require a personal conversion to a new way of life and a sincere attitude of repentance from the older way of life of everyone who desired and welcomed it. In the gospel text written by St. Matthew, we find these words attributed to Jesus. Therefore, I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you shall eat or what you shall drink, nor about your body, what you shall put on. Is not life more than food and the body more than clothing? Look at the birds of the air, they neither sow nor reap, nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not of more value than they? And which of you, by being anxious, can add 1 cubit to his span of life? And why are you anxious about clothing? Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin, yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass of the field, which today is alive and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, will he not much more clothe you, O men of little faith? Therefore, do not be anxious, saying, what shall we eat? Or what shall we drink? Or what shall we wear? For the Gentiles seek all these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them all. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things shall be yours as well. That's Matthew chapter 6, verses 25 to 33. I think it is clear from this that Jesus recommends here a lifestyle that is open to learn from observing the natural world and further finds life lessons there. That is, to those who take the time to pay attention, principles are found in our natural world for living a life that is not destructively obsessed about dressing in the latest fashion or frequently worried about decisions on what to eat or what to drink. We can also detect here, I think, a teaching to live fully in the beauty and richness of the moment, rather than, say, in regret over the past or in anxiety about tomorrow. A consumerist lifestyle fails to read this message. I think we can move up one, Rabbi. Yeah, there we go. A consumerist lifestyle fails to read this message. It is a way of living that is often driven by desires and anxieties, heedless of the emotional or ecological consequences once these superficial, manipulated, and endless concerns are acted upon. In such a teaching that has been challenging the norms of all cultures over the ages, we find for our own times a proposition to live values consistent with a new social reality that seems freer and more peaceful than that offered by our liberal economic system and a materialistic view of the successful ideal lifestyle. The question also arises, let's move up one, thank you, about the kind of relationship to our natural home that Jesus models for us in his own way of living. He had that closeness and attentiveness to nature that revealed life lessons around him in the behavior of animals and the beauty of plants. And he shared these with his followers as a way to keep them focused on what was really important and vital for their new lives of closeness to God. Indeed, Jesus heard a message from God in the natural life around him, showing a capacity for attention to the biosphere of our planet that Pope Francis, in this encyclical letter of 2015, Laudato Si, encourages all of us to discover and develop within us as well, which actualizes these teachings for today. So Pope Francis, in his 2015 letter on the environment, expands on this specific perspective, born of a lifestyle of attentiveness to our natural home that Jesus of Nazareth models for us. He writes, "The entire material universe speaks of God's love, of his boundless affection for us. Soil, water, mountains, everything is, as it were, a caress of God. The history of our friendship with God is always linked to particular places which take on an intensely personal meaning. We all remember places, and revisiting those memories does us much good. God has written a precious book whose letters are the multitude of created things present in the universe. The Canadian bishops," Pope Francis continues, "rightly pointed out that no creature is excluded from this manifestation of God. From panoramic vistas to the tiniest living form, nature is a constant source of wonder and awe. It is also a continuing revelation of the divine." The bishops of Japan, for their part, made a thought-provoking observation. To sense each creature singing the hymn of its existence is to live joyfully in God's love and hope. This contemplation of creation, Francis continues, allows us to discover in each thing a teaching which God wishes to hand on to us, since for the believer, to contemplate creation is to hear a message, to listen to a paradoxical and silent voice. End quote. This logically leads Pope Francis, whose teachings are considered authoritative by Catholic Christians, to identify anthropocentrism as a major obstacle to creating a healthy attitude towards our natural home. Modern anthropocentrism means prizing technical thought over reality, ignoring the intrinsic dignity of the world. Anthropocentrism refers, using the Greek word for man, anthropos, and putting that to stand for the human being who considers reality only in as much as reality serves the human being. This also leads to ignoring our own place in the world and the natural and moral structure found within us. Pope Francis continues, when human beings place themselves at the center, they give absolute priority to immediate convenience, and all else becomes relative. Hence, we should not be surprised to find, in conjunction with the omnipresent technocratic paradigm and the cult of unlimited human power, the rise of a relativism which sees everything as irrelevant unless it serves one's own immediate interests. There is a logic in all this whereby different attitudes can feed on one another, leading to environmental degradation and social decay, end quote. It is characteristic of Christian thought, especially within the groundwork of the social gospel movement in the Protestant world in the late 19th century. Go ahead, Rabbi. Thank you. And it is also characteristic of the social justice tradition in the Catholic world at the same time to include the social dimension of our environmental crisis and to link both ecological destruction and people in poverty as the two victims of the same attitude, an attitude that is rampant in what Francis calls a throwaway culture. The relativism I mentioned before, fostered by that priority of convenience in an anthropocentric focus. Francis writes, it's the same disorder which drives one person to take advantage of another and to treat others as mere objects, imposing forced labor on them or enslaving them to pay their debts. The same kind of thinking leads to the sexual exploitation of children and abandonment of the elderly who no longer serve our interests. It is also the mindset of those who say, let us allow the invisible forces of the market to regulate the economy and consider their impact on society and nature as collateral damage, end quote. This rather obviously then brings with it a criticism of the sorts of economic theory and practice that objectivize and discard vast sectors of society. Go ahead, Rabbi. In the interest of maximizing monetary profits for relatively few members. The prophetic criticism of divisions within society between rich and poor, oppressors and the oppressed, found in the Hebrew scriptures commonly called the Old Testament by Christians, is continued by Jesus of Nazareth when he offers the stories and parables that remind his listeners, challenging many, of the inherent dignity of every human being, which needs to be respected as a fundamental condition for a peaceful and ordered society. We clearly see this truth in the killings of Black people by police in our own country, a racist form of violence which has led to a social unrest that undermines our protection of the natural environment as a good common to all of us. There is no ecological justice without racial justice, something that Sunrise El Paso movement has declared this year. A clear reminder of how everything is connected, with a priority placed on the social conditions that permit us to uphold the common good of a healthy relationship with our planet. Back to you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Father Bob. I'm sorry, I'm such a terrible slide burner, but keep me on it. From a Jewish perspective, moving forward in time, just the way I began with Genesis and that early text, and then Father Mosher moved us into the next stages. I'd like to move us forward in the stages of Jewish development and thinking about sustainability and stewardship. In Jewish tradition, by the way, the biblical text is coupled with rabbinic interpretation of that text to evaluate codes and ethics for living in the world that we find ourselves in. So to be a Jew in the modern world is to be a Jew who is descended not only from the biblical tradition, but also from the rabbinic tradition of interpreting the Bible. Rabbinic law is known in Hebrew as halakha, and it stipulates not only very specifically what to do or not do in certain circumstances, but it also offers broader values and ideals through which we should view the world. And with regards to ecological stewardship, the rabbis who wrote this literature between the beginning of the Common Era and the year around roughly 600 of the Common Era usually looked at these questions about how our obligations to the world and to the planet in three ways. They looked to the book of Deuteronomy's requirement to avoid destruction, even when at war. The book of Leviticus' obligation to sustain life and avoid standing idly by the blood of your neighbor. And the third one, the sense of modesty as human beings that echoes the book of Genesis and reminds us to care for the world, not only for ourselves, and not only for God, but also for the sake of future generations. So to begin, and we're only going to scratch the surface on each of these three major ways of thinking about our obligations to the world, I'd like to start with that Deuteronomy text. I'm sort of going to go backwards through the biblical, the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. So Bal Tashchit, in the traditional way of talking about it, do not destroy, comes from Deuteronomy chapter 20, where we read, when thou shalt besiege a city a long time, in making war against it to take it, thou shalt not destroy the trees thereof by wielding an axe against them. For thou mayest eat of them, but thou shalt not cut them down. For is the tree of the field man, that it should be besieged of thee? Only the trees of which thou knowest that they are not trees for food, them thou mayest destroy and cut down, that thou mayest build bulwarks against the city that maketh war with thee until it fall. So even in the midst of war, when a lot of rules change, and when a lot of our responsibilities and our ethics are sort of lined up with the needs of war, hopefully not too often, but we have to admit it has happened. That's the way it happens. Even when you're in the midst of war, you don't get to just destroy. You have to think very carefully about what you're doing and how you're doing it and how it affects the world, the planet, and the people who might come after you. By the way, I should also acknowledge that while in the ancient world, they could see a fruit coming down out of a tree and hanging from a tree and say, this is a fruit-bearing tree. It therefore has use and purpose. They didn't always necessarily know the purpose or the use of other kinds of trees. And science has progressed to such an extent that we might legitimately say there is no such thing as a tree that doesn't bear fruit. So just to put that out there as well. In the Middle Ages, this was written about in an educational book called Sefer HaChinuch, which is the book of learning or the book of guidance. And in talking about this obligation that comes directly from the Bible and informs the biblical rabbinic literature, they write, the root of this commandment is well known. It is in order to teach our souls to love good and purpose and to cling to it. And through this, good clings to us, and we will distance ourselves from all bad and destructive things. And this is the way of the pious and people of proper action. They love peace and are happy for the good of the creatures and bring them close to Torah. And they do not destroy even a grain of mustard in the world. And they are distressed by all loss and destruction that they see. And if they can prevent it, they will prevent any destruction with all of their strength. But not so are the wicked, the brothers of the destructive spirits. They rejoice in the destruction of the world and they destroy themselves, since in the way that a person measures, so is he measured, which is to say that he clings to it forever, as the matter that is written in Proverbs. The one who rejoices in calamity will not be cleared of evil. And the one who desires the good and rejoices in it, his soul will dwell in the good forever. This is known and famous. Now, there are other traditions that talk, other religious faiths that talk about this concept too. What goes around comes around. And the way that you put yourself out into the world is the kind of experience that you will receive back. And already in this text, we see the rabbis really thinking carefully about how if we worry and think carefully about how we make use of and avoid destroying the things around us, that's going to come back for the good for us as well. If we are destructive people, we are going to find that destruction comes back to us. So that's one major way that the rabbis and traditional thinking think through what we are permitted to do and not permitted to do with our natural resources. The second one I wanted to address, and I have to say, this is perhaps the most important law of Jewish tradition, is pikuach nefesh, saving a life and preserving health. And this concept, this law of placing life above most everything else is such an important law that it is deemed as more important than almost any other law. That is to say, you are permitted to violate almost any other law of the biblical or the rabbinic tradition for the sake of saving a life. And in Leviticus 19:16, we read, "You shall not be a talebearer among your people." And here's the important piece. "You shall not stand idly by the blood of your neighbor. I am Adonai your God. I am God." And in the Babylonian Talmud, in the rabbinic literature that becomes the authoritative text for the Jewish people, and when we ask ourselves, what am I supposed to do in a certain situation, we look to the Talmud. We read, Adam, or that first human being, was created alone, singularly, to teach that anyone who destroys one soul from the Jewish people, it is as if he destroys an entire world. And anyone who sustains one soul from the Jewish people, the verse ascribes him credit as if he sustained an entire world. So while we have Bal Tashchit, do not destroy, with regards to our obligation to the natural world, and to not just randomly go engage in wanton destruction, we also have an obligation to think through how what we do affects other people. This quickly becomes a conversation about how what we're doing in business and how what we're doing in industry can possibly affect others, and how we have to be very careful. Just want to again say, Pikuach Nefesh is one of the most important, if not the most important, laws of Jewish tradition. And we're limited on time, and that's all I'm going to really say about that. But it becomes obvious what the requirements are with regards to when we're engaging in an industry that's going to pollute water or pollute the air and make the people around us sick or ill, or make it impossible for them to live a healthy and productive life. We have obligations that go beyond just not destroying the planet. We also have to think very carefully about how what we're doing ecologically affects the other creatures and the other human beings with which we're supposed to be sharing the planet. And that leads into a conversation that is the third way of thinking about this from a rabbinic Jewish perspective, which is humility and human preservation. We see a sense of humility in the text of Genesis when we read that we are given the world to take care of it, but not for ourselves, for God's sake. It is a gift, and we have the obligations to take care of it as if we're holding it in trust for God. In rabbinic literature, we read that man was created last. Why was he created last? So that he not become haughty. He is told, a gnat preceded you in the act of creation. Another explanation, so that he immediately began his meal. They drew an analogy to what made this can be compared to a king who built a palace, dedicated it, prepared a meal, and then afterwards invited guests. Right? I want to focus on that first part. A gnat preceded you in the act of creation, which reminds us that we have to think very carefully before we kill the gnat. Right? We might think, this thing is frustrating, it's annoying, and it's bothering me, but it was here before we were. So what business do we have? And we could talk about the meal piece at another time. I want to jump down to the bottom to look at another rabbinic tradition where there's a commentary on the book of Ecclesiastes. We read in Ecclesiastes chapter 7, look at God's work, for who can straighten what God has twisted? And the rabbis say, when the Holy Blessed One created the first human being, he took him and led him around all the trees of the Garden of Eden and said to him, look at my works. How beautiful and praiseworthy are they? And all that I have created, it was for you that I created it. Pay attention that you do not corrupt and destroy my world. If you corrupt it, there is no one to repair it after you. We get one shot at this. And I want to close this with a famous Jewish story that comes from that Talmudic text about Honi. Honi the wise one was also known as Honi the circle maker. By drawing a circle and stepping inside of it, he would recite special prayers for rain, sometimes even argue with God during a drought, and the rains would come. And he was indeed a miracle maker. As wise as he was, Honi sometimes saw something that puzzled him, and then he would ask questions so that he could unravel the mystery. One day, Honi the circle maker was walking on the road and saw a man planting a carob tree. Honi asked the man, "How long will it take for this tree to bear fruit?" And the man replied, 70 years. Honi then asked the man, "And do you think you will live another 70 years to eat the fruit of this tree?" And the man answered, "Perhaps not. However, when I was born into this world, I found many carob trees planted by my father and grandfather. Just as they planted trees for me, I am planting trees for my children and grandchildren, so they will be able to eat the fruit of these trees." And I think you can see how this story reflects, the cause and the concern that we are all gathered here to think through today, which is how do we maintain and protect and take care of the world so that we have something to leave to future generations, so that the beauty that we see is still there for next generations. And how do we scale back the destruction that we are seeing as well to ensure that it's there for next generation? So 3 ways of thinking about this from a rabbinic perspective. From the concept of not destroying, just because we don't destroy, it comes back, destruction comes back to us. From the sense of worrying about the health and well-being of our fellow human beings. And also from the sense of being modest and humble, and recognizing that we're not the only ones who are here. We have obligations to God, but we also have obligations to future generations.
Well said.
Yeah, that third principle is a good plug for the Million Tree Program.
I didn't want to interrupt them, but yes,
Yeah.
I've seen a lot of really good memes and pictures out there, but you don't always plant the tree for yourself, right? It's for our future. So very cool.
Okay, I've got a segment now coming up on the continuing the Christian contributions. Rabbi, oh, there it is. Okay, thank you. In the parable of Jesus about the Good Samaritan, he clearly proposes a special concern on the part of every human being for the person who is found half dead at the side of the road, even when that person does not belong to one's own nationality or group. That's why Jesus said he was a Samaritan, he wasn't a Jew. This is clearly applicable to immediate cases of extreme need, such as homelessness or accidents. But by extension, it becomes a teaching on the importance of creating whole societies that attend to the needs of those most vulnerable members of these societies, prioritizing the resources they have for making sure that the victims of poverty and violence and racism are not only given immediate care for their survival, but, as the parable makes clear, are restored to the conditions that allow people thorough and ready access to their own fulfillment, in the words of Pope Francis. The text goes, on one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" "What is written in the law?" he replied. "How do you read it?" He answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." "You have answered correctly," Jesus replied. "Do this and you will live." But he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" In reply, Jesus said, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine, and then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. Jesus told him, go and do likewise. That text is from the Gospel of St. Luke, chapter 10, verses 25 to 37. When we adopt a holistic and relational perspective towards our natural home, recognizing the direct relationship between our own condition and the condition of the planet as between 2 members of the same family, then we recognize the applicability of such a story to our own situation and how easy it is to perceive Mother Nature as the victim of violence, lying half dead by the road and avoided by people too wrapped up in their own individual lives, fearful of contaminating themselves or arriving late at their destinations, who fail to recognize their fundamental familial connection to the severely injured party. Thus, we can base our lifestyle of sustainability on our desire to prevent any further suffering for those already severely impacted by climate change and toxic waste, who are the people in coastal areas flooding with increasing intensity and frequency from the rising level of the ocean, in areas affected by ever more powerful and frequent hurricanes, such as Hurricane Zeta in this moment, the poorest and most vulnerable lying by the road, as it were, like the victim of violence in Jesus's parable. But further, it is not difficult to apply this perspective to our environment itself. In our common home, Pope Francis tells us, is like a sister with whom we share our life and a beautiful mother who opens her arms to embrace us. This sister now cries out to us because of the harm we have inflicted on her by our irresponsible use and abuse of the goods with which God has endowed her. We have come to see ourselves as her lords and masters, entitled to plunder her at will. The violence present in our hearts, wounded by sin, is also reflected in the symptoms of sickness evident in the soil, in the water, in the air, and in all forms of life. This is why the earth itself, burdened and laid waste, is among the most abandoned and maltreated of our poor. She groans in travail, as it says in Romans 8, verse 22. We have forgotten that we ourselves are dust of the earth, as mentioned in Genesis chapter 2, verse 7. Our very bodies are made up of her elements. We breathe her air, and we receive life and refreshment from her waters, end quote. The early fathers of the church, as we rather patriarchally call the first 500 years or so of the Christian era, these fathers of the church were known to write on the principle of intergenerational responsibility for the state of the environment, likening our lifetimes to a period of staying in an inn while on a long journey. The question that arises in the form of moral duty for each guest at the inn is how the guest is going to leave the room for future generations, for future guests. Next slide, please. In the same way, early thinkers proposed it is a moral duty of human beings to also consider, next slide, in what state they will leave the earth after they leave the scene for future generations of human beings. Pope Francis in his letter helps us situate the further development over nearly 2 millennia of a healthy and even reverential regard for our natural home in Christian thinking, building on this perspective of a close relationship with our natural environments. In Laudato Si, his letter on the environment that was published in 2015. And in this way, finding inspiration for a holistic perspective on our ecological crisis and our sustainable solutions. For instance, the case of St. Thomas Aquinas. St. Thomas Aquinas wisely noted that multiplicity and variety come from the intention of the first agent, as he called the first mover or creator of the universe, who willed that what was wanting to one in the representation of the divine goodness might be supplied by another, inasmuch as God's goodness, quote, could not be represented fittingly by any one creature, end quote. Hence, we need to grasp, Francis wrote, the variety of things and their multiple relationships. We understand better the importance and meaning of each creature if we contemplate it within the entirety of God's plan. As the Catechism of the Catholic Church teaches, God wills the interdependence of creatures, the sun and the moon, the cedar and the little flower, the eagle and the sparrow, the spectacle of their countless diversities and inequalities tells us that no creature is self-sufficient. Creatures exist only in dependence on each other to complete each other in the service of each other. Pope Francis highlights the holistic vision of another saint, Saint Francis, of the town of Assisi in Italy, as a perspective that recognizes the close relationship between the human family and its natural home, spoken of in a startlingly clear language of family relationships. St. Francis wrote, "Praised be you, my Lord, with all your creatures, especially Sir Brother's Son, who is the day and through whom you give us light. And he is beautiful and radiant with great splendor and bears a likeness of you, Most High. Praised be you, my Lord, through Sister Moon and the stars in heaven, which you form them clear and precious and beautiful. Praised be you, my Lord, through Brother Wind, and through the air, cloudy and serene, and every kind of weather, through whom you give sustenance to your creatures. Praised be you, my Lord, through Sister Water, who is very useful and humble, and precious and chaste. Praised be you, my Lord, through Brother Fire, through whom you light the night, and he is beautiful and playful and robust and strong," end quote. These close family relationships also, coincidentally, enumerate some alternative sources of natural clean energy: solar, tidal, wind, water, and perhaps thermal as well, that our natural family provides us. I invite Rabbi Zeidman now to wrap up our presentation with his own input on the modern developments in his tradition.
Thank you, Father Mosher. I was just so taken by how many similarities there are. And, I think that what you'll see, what everyone will see, is that there's a direct line that extends through the Jewish tradition in thinking about this, from Torah to the rabbinic period, and now into the modern expression of ancient and medieval thinking, and how to deal with big questions around environment and ecology and our responsibilities in those realms today. So thinking back about that obligation to not destroy anything, the Coalition on the Environment in Jewish Life puts out a number of statements. And one example of something that they've said is, in the way that they've put this into our thinking today, the principle of Bal Tashchit, of do not destroy, prohibits the needless waste of anything from food to fuel. Today, in light of the environmental crisis, using disposables, leaving lights on unnecessarily, overutilization of air conditioning, or driving a car when it is not necessary might be considered a violation of the principle. And that is to say, I would suggest the law of bal tashchit, of do not destroy or do not engage in needless destruction. In the 14th century, Rabbi Isaac, son of Sheshet, responded to questions about what we're permitted to do in business if our livelihoods can potentially affect somebody else by making this law in which he stated one is forbidden from gaining a livelihood at the expense of another's health. That is to say, I'm sorry, you don't have a choice. You don't get to do that thing if it potentially endangers somebody else. And one of my favorite quotes from Avot Rabbi Natan: if you have a sapling in your hand and people tell you that the Messiah has come, plant the sapling and then go and greet the Messiah. We have responsibilities that go above and beyond what we might want for ourselves, even our own personal desire to go and greet the Messiah. We've been tasked with responsibilities in this world, and those come first. So Samson Raphael Hirsch, who is the founder of modern orthodoxy in Judaism, wrote in a response or a conversation as well, that in fact, one who destroys something, in truth, there is no one nearer to idolatry than one who can disregard the fact that all things are the creatures and property of God, and then who then presumes to have the right, because he has the might, to destroy them according to a presumptuous act of will. If you should regard the beings beneath you as objects without rights, then not perceiving God who created them, and therefore desire that they feel the might of your presumptuous mood instead of using them only as the means of wise human activity, then God's call proclaims to you, do not destroy anything. Be a mensch, and mensch in Yiddish is a good, a decent, a kind human being. Only if you use the things around you for wise human purposes, sanctified by the word of my teaching, only then are you a mensch and have the right over them which I have given you as a human. However, if you destroy, if you ruin, at that moment you are not a human, and so you therefore have no right to the things around you. I lent them to you for wise use only. Never forget that I lent them to you. As soon as you use them unwisely, be it the greatest or the smallest, you commit treachery against my world, you commit murder and robbery against my property, you sin against me. In truth, there is no one nearer to idolatry than one who can disregard the fact that all things are the creatures and property of God, and who then presumes to have the right, because he has the might, to destroy them according to a presumptuous act of will. Yes, that one is already serving the most powerful idols, anger, pride, and above all, ego, which in its passions regards itself as the master of things. And I love the way that he states that in that conversation there, Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch. And I think I'll leave it there to say, there's this one other concept, and there's the Coalition of the Environment and Jewish Life in general, which I recommend anybody who's interested in this take a look at. But I just want to finish by saying I really believe that with regards to how Jewish tradition thinks about religion, our obligations to the world, to the planet, it doesn't even necessarily matter how you understand God or God's role in your life. Jewish tradition says that you have obligations and you have responsibilities beyond your own personal beliefs and faiths. And that is with regards to how your responsibility to the world impacts your decisions, impacts your behavior, and causes you to walk in your life as somebody who cares for, who tends, who is a steward of the earth. And whatever your personal faith, practice, or belief, those obligations are ours as human beings. And Judaism really extends that tradition and that concept throughout our lives and into our obligations as individual people, as business owners, as people who make policy decisions, as people who make decisions about whether to protest the building of power plants that are known to destroy and to harm people. All of those ways of thinking and more are implied in this through Jewish tradition, regardless of whether you're Jewish, but just by nature of the fact of who we are meant to be as human beings and what we're meant to think about as people who worry about the future. So I'll leave it there and turn it over to Father Mosher for his final comments as well.
Thanks, Rabbi. So finally, in my own, it's important for me to conclude with the central truth of our Christian faith, the most important affirmation. As Pope Francis put it, the New Testament not only tells us of the earthly Jesus and his tangible and loving relationship with the world, it also shows him risen and glorious, present throughout creation by his universal lordship. So to conclude, the central truth of the Christian faith is specifically that, the suffering, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And more than a truth to be believed in, it is perceived as a reality in the life of every member of the Christian faith community, today visibly divided into separate churches, as we know, but spiritually still one body of many parts, thanks to this gift of new life that makes us all partners with God in the growing reality of God's reign on the earth that Jesus came to inaugurate and announce. The sustainable lifestyle is a sign of the greater harmony with our natural home that God brings about in our lives graciously, since the victory of Christ over the tomb, a saving and liberating reality in which we participate, reconciles all our relationships with God, with each other, and with creation itself. And we also belong to a larger community beyond the Christian faith communities. And that is the basis of our conviction, Pope Francis writes, that as part of the universe, called into being by one Father, all of us are linked by unseen bonds and together form a kind of universal family, a sublime communion which fills us with a sacred, affectionate, and humble respect. Here I would reiterate that God has joined us so closely to the world around us that we can feel the desertification of the soil almost as a physical ailment, and the extinction of a species as a painful disfigurement, end quote. I would be amiss if I did not mention some statements from other Christian bodies and traditions, just briefly, who share with Catholics the same passion for reconciling ourselves to God's creation through sustainable policies and lifestyles, which require both personal and social conversion to ecological justice. For instance, the Eastern Orthodox Church, in the person of their Patriarch of Constantinople, has said for our Orthodox Church, the protection of the environment as God's creation is the supreme responsibility of human beings. The Anglican Church here in the United States is known as the Episcopalian Church, and they have a document that has a statement: the Genesis Covenant is a multi-faith effort to engage national faith communities in a single and significant course of action to reduce the damaging effects of climate change. That course of action is to work to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions of each facility they maintain by 50% in 10 years. Our brothers and sisters in the Baptist churches have a statement that came out in 2008 at their Southern Baptist Convention meeting, and said in part, we pledge to find ways to curb ecological degradation through promoting biblical stewardship habits and increasing awareness in our homes, businesses, and where we find influence, relationships with others and our local churches. The Lutherans, the Methodists, the Disciples of Christ, and the Pentecostals are all members of our one community, Christian community of faith. Next slide. There we are. And I can provide those statements in the text that I will send as one of the resources for this presentation. So thank you very much. Shelby, I think we can go to questions or comments.
Yes. Thank you both very, very much. It's really interesting to hear all the commonalities across all the different faiths. And I'm very, very happy to have you both here. And Father Bob, for those that didn't know, is actually on our board of directors for Eco El Paso. So he doesn't just say these things. He walks the walk. And funny enough, before I even moved to El Paso back in, 2010 maybe, Father Bob was actually one of my first customers in El Paso. I started a team in El Paso because I wanted to be in every Texas major city. And El Paso obviously gets neglected a lot. And I wanted to make sure we had a team here. My wife is from here, so I wanted to set up a team, and they were able to put solar on Father Bob's house. So I really love that you you really live by your words. So thank you guys both for being here. And yes, let's open it up. If there is anyone on Zoom and you'd like to ask any questions now, we can do that. And if you have follow-ups, you can always email us. But I thought I would just open up to anyone that is on Zoom if you want to unmute and continue the discussion.
Shelby, this is Juan Villalobos. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Well, the biggest thing I got from the presentation was the do not destroy part, Rabbi. That was awesome. And what I really got out of it too was that it makes sense, you know, the lights and everything else. Fortunately, in many industries, including the lighting industry, the air conditioning industry, they're doing all they can to make things more efficient, and that's helping out. And I just want to throw this out there, and I know Shelby, you're involved with some of this stuff, but in order to be sustainable, we also have to think a lot about other things, that the consequences of what it takes for us to be sustainable, right? Like, you know, we're doing all these solar panels that we're putting everywhere, and then now it's turning out that's what's going to happen with, and I brought this up last year on the seminar also, what's going to happen with all the hazardous waste is going to be generated, you know, from all these solar panels.
Luckily, I'm actually dealing with that right now because I've got a good friend that installs multi-megawatt solar systems, right? So huge football fields. And there are more and more companies every year that are getting into the recycling of solar panels and any materials from wind energy blades. There are definitely some components that we have to treat carefully. But I do think that now that solar is getting bigger and people are at the end of 10 and 20 and 25 years of having a system where the solar panel warranties start to end, although the panels will last much longer, there are more and more companies that are opening up that there's going to probably be a cost, mostly just shipping it to them if they're not local, that will be able to recycle parts of the glass, parts of the wiring that comes out of the panels. The aluminum, all the different frames of all the solar panels are aluminum. Now, I don't think every single part can be recycled, but I think that that's a big concern that a lot of people have about solar in the future is when those 25-year systems do start to fall offline, what do we do? Luckily, they'll last longer than that. So I think that's one thing. But B, I think it's going to create a whole new industry because we can't just send solar panels that are decommissioned to the landfill. We just can't do that, right? So I think this is going to be something that sort of solves itself over time. I think there are a few companies that are filling in the gap right now of that niche. And I personally hope others pop up soon because I think that it will be a big problem in the long run. I don't think it's a huge problem today, but it is starting to be a problem here and there across the country.
Yeah, because you got cadmium, you got lead, you got all sorts of copper and problems like that are really going to be hard to recycle. And I just bring this up because I work with a lot of demolition as a general contractor, and a lot of the products that we demolish has to do with asbestos. So one thing, asbestos was a fantastic thing because it's a heck of an insulation, but then look at what it's doing to us now. And I'm just thinking, what's going to happen this other thing if you guys don't take care of all the products that could eventually end up in landfills that are going to be hurting the groundwater and stuff. So I just throw it out there as I'm thinking, that not destroy, just hit a bell for me. So, but I'm glad your industry is thinking like that, and I'm hoping that things do get better, and we're gonna go, hopefully, like you say, give it time, and eventually, Shelby, hopefully most of these things eventually, God willing, will be taken care of, and then eventually we'll have things like nuclear fusion that would really help a lot, so that maybe we don't have to fabricate so many panels, or eventually they make them to where they're completely recyclable. But other than that, it's just I wanted to throw that out there and just to say,
Sure.
okay, as best as 25 years from now.
Yeah. There's always issues down the road, right, with new innovation that you don't see today that sort of plays out down the road. But yeah, I don't think there's anything perfect. Like you said, there's a lot of elements inside a solar panel that could be toxic. So I just think things are going to improve, right? Like you're talking about asbestos, whereas nowadays it's spray foam insulation in buildings. So I'm already seeing the change that
Yeah.
hopefully you'll see, and you won't have to deal with those chemicals. But no,
Yeah.
I totally get it. And I think also the other thing is it shouldn't all be on the consumer. Businesses, especially the businesses that make the products, at some point have to be held accountable, right? Coca-Cola can't just ship out billions of plastic bottles around the world and say, well, it's your fault. You didn't recycle it, or come up with a production recycling facility that could turn it into another product, right? So yeah, luckily for me,
That's
that just means
exactly
more
a good point.
problems means things I can solve, hopefully. So hopefully, right? Or future generations can solve. But thank you for your question.
Thank you for taking that. Thank you.
I was going to just thank the speakers. I haven't met most of you, but I'm a design professional and I've been involved with ECHO for a while now. I really connected with this topic. Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, Father. I'm a follower of Christ and a student of the scriptures, and I appreciate you helping me to see this congruency in the spiritual world and the physical world. Thank you.
One of the things I was thinking about with the previous question, which I think goes to, and thank you, sir, is, to me, religion really pushes us to strive to be better, and to be more ethical, and to strive towards righteousness. And that often means pushing back against what our human tendencies might be, which is to look out for ourselves and no one else, and to be and to get the thing for the cheapest that we possibly can get, and not to worry about anybody else, and not to worry about their neighbor or the next generation. And so a lot of this implies to me, to the previous question, the idea that we may need to well, first off, we need to do the best that we can, right? And we're going to learn down the line that we made mistakes. And what we have to do is we have to feel like we can look ourselves in the mirror and say, are we doing the best we can in thinking about the world, the planet, the future, and our obligations in that sense? And then secondly, and I think it's sort of counterintuitive in most people's minds, but this concept of religious tradition and our religious obligations to the world implies that we have an obligation as a society to significantly invest in science, and in scientific thought, and in educating young scientists, and in investing in the future, by investing in scientific endeavors. And I don't know how many times we talk about religion and science, but that is what this is really about, right? If we can move the science forward, then we're going to be able to respond to those issues, like what were the ones that were brought up about recycling and technology and things like that. So the more that we can invest in our future, and it's going to take money, and it's going to take resources, and it's going to take people, the more that we can live up to our righteous and highest ideals.
Which
Well
is,
said.
just to piggyback on that, I really like the rabbi's perspective, because too often religions are criticized from people outside the religions as supporting the status quo, rather a status quo that is often very destructive of human rights and of bringing needed changes into society, when actually all of our authentic religions in the world, as the rabbi was saying, have a function of challenging people of each generation to face up to the hypocrisy and the not living out of our highest values. Religion does have that role, and we can see that when even representatives of religion are sometimes persecuted and assassinated for daring to challenge and speaking truth to power. So I'm glad Rabbi mentioned that role of religion. I think it's one that we need to keep recovering in our own practice.
Yes, sir. Well spoken. Well, I think we've been going for about an hour and 15, so I think that ought to wrap it up today. But thank you, Rabbi Ben, Zeidman, and Father Bob, for both of you attending today. Thank you for anyone that could attend live and your questions and being here and supporting us. Again, we are an all-volunteer nonprofit, and every dollar we raise, we give back to the community. But I just wanted to thank you, and we will post these videos on our YouTube channel later today. And I'll get this over to Father Bob and Rabbi Ben. But again, thank you both very much. Thank you everyone for attending, and we hope to see you in person soon.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
Thank you, Shelby. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Rabbi. It was great partnering with you.
Thank you, Father. It's always a joy to learn with you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Take care.
Thanks, Shelby.
Bye-bye.